Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Weiss, and I'd like to welcome you to the Surgent CPA Review webinar, How to Pass the CPA Exam in 6 Months. I am Vice President of Market Development, and I have been with Surgent for the last 2 years. I'm located out of the Philadelphia region, and I manage our academic and business-to-business relationships for the company. I've been involved with CPA Review for going on 19 years now, and it is a pleasure not only to be involved with this company, but to have the ability to speak to everybody this afternoon about hopefully helping you achieve your goals and do it in a timely manner, as the title of the webinar suggests. So we have about 30 to 35 minutes of content that I'd like to share with you. At the end of the webinar, we will send everybody out a copy of the slides in a PDF format. We will also send out a link to the recording, and in addition, we will send out a special offer for those of you who may be thinking about signing up for the course, and some more information about our product. Along the way, we also have a couple things I'd like to share with you. We have a couple ways of submitting questions, either through a chat room, or at the top of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. If you have any questions along the way, go ahead and submit them. We will take questions at the end of the webinar, and we'll spend a few minutes at the end if everybody has those, or if anybody has any questions along the way. So again, we'll get started. So one thing I want everybody to keep in mind is that the title of this webinar is how to pass the CPA exam in 6 months. So although we're going to give you some information about scheduling your exams and how you want to do it, the real meat of this discussion is and relates to not just how to schedule, but some time management tips along the way as it relates to test taking, as it relates to the registration process, which parts to take, etc. You know, passing the exam in 6 months is it is a lofty aspiration. I will not won't kid anybody on that. You know, people typically will ask us, you know, how long should we set aside to pass the CPA exam? In a perfect world, it's about 9 months. 9 months gives you optimal time to schedule and reschedule a part if you need to, and it doesn't bump you up against the 18 months. However, that said, 6 months is doable. It requires an added layer of time management and an added layer of dedication. But as you'll see as we go along, it definitely is doable. So today's agenda, we're going to talk through three things: what we term the self-assessment portion. We have some recommendations, and then we'll talk about exam review format towards the end, and then open it up for Q&A. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first thing that needs to happen is you need to develop a study plan. And that sounds sort of self-obvious, right? Or self-evident, right? Obviously, we need to develop a study plan. But even going beyond that, the real question is, when should you take the CPA exam? That's the question that needs to be answered first. When should one take the CPA exam? The answer to that is as close to college graduation as possible, or as I like to term it, as close to as when you are eligible to take the exam. Statistics have proven that those who take the exam closest to their college experience have the highest possible pass rates, because you're in that study mode. And this is not necessarily, it does correlate in many cases with age, because the majority of college students are, you know, in their early 20s, but the real key is as close to your college graduation experience as possible. So even if you are an adult who has gone back to school, you know, maybe you're getting your requisite accounting units, you've had a career change, or you've decided to finally go ahead and pursue your accounting degree, whatever that is, we ask that you, or we push people to do it as soon as possible to their graduation or when they're eligible. However, not to worry if it's been a while. One of the things that we do at Surgent is, before we start anybody along their way into any type of study plan or study program, we give them an exhaustive assessment, which actually gives gives the student a real idea of where they are, of where their strengths are, of where their weaknesses are, and where they need to focus. And the reason why that assessment done is twofold. One, as everyone I'm sure knows, our platform is truly adaptive, and it adapts to your areas of weakness along with your areas of strength as you study. But the assessment also, because of its exhaustive nature, also starts people on the learning path right away. So as you're going through this assessment of multiple choice questions, before you ever open up a book, before you look at a video, there's learning that happens along the way. And that learning is very, very helpful, especially for those folks who maybe it's been a while since they've taken a college class. So again, at the end, I'll be happy to discuss that in more detail, or offline. Obviously, we'll take any questions about our course that you'd like to know. So the next question then is, what sequence should I sit for? How should I take the exams? Which part should I sit for first, etc.? So as everybody knows, the exam is on demand. You take one part at a time, and you have 18 months from the date you pass your first part. You have 18 months to pass the other 3 parts. It is on demand, as I mentioned, and you can sit for any part in any particular order. Typically, however, we do recommend that you go in the order that you see on the screen. So we recommend that you take financial first, then auditing, then regulation, and then BEC. A couple comments on why, and one exception. So great reason to take financial first is that financial accounting and reporting is the most voluminous of all the parts in terms of the amount of material that has to be studied and the range of topics. Oftentimes, people think that it's the most difficult, even though the pass rates among financial audit and regulation are very similar. They're within a percentage point of each other, but it's deemed the most difficult, again, because of how much material has to be studied. Also, what happens too is when you get into the other parts, especially auditing, you're going to see some concepts that are going to come up that have some overlap with financial. And then having that base foundation and having studied that is going to help you in the other sections, especially auditing. Also, there's a psychological component to it as well. There's a lot of people, we poll a lot of students and get a lot of feedback from people who've taken the exam, and getting over the hurdle of financial first, when again, it has so much material to cover. Sometimes it feels like you've accomplished the big hurdle first, and it in theory makes the other 3 parts easier. So again, it's, you can take any part that you want, but all things being equal, we recommend you take financial first. Now, the one caveat to that might be the fact, if you're in the exam process already, you might want to consider taking regulation before the end of 2018. As everybody knows, there was a major overhaul. There was tax reform that was passed by our government, and those new laws and regulations are going to begin being tested in January of 2019. So I throw that out there. Some people would like to get that out of the way and not even have the psychological component of thinking about changes that they may have to study, but it's something just to think about. Now, let's talk about the actual components of sitting in 6 months. So if you take a look at the exam calendar here, these are the testing windows. Now, I'm making an assumption that based on the people that are on this webinar, that many of you, if not most, are going to be exam eligible starting now and being able to start testing in the 3rd window of this year in July. So, based on that we would be talking then about July and August, October and November. But a 6-month window to sit for the exam and pass, really, you can do it with any 6 months of the exam calendar. So, if we were, let's say that you're a college graduate, you're eligible to sit, you've had your degree conferred on you and you're exam eligible in May, then really the first real opportunity would be in July. And so you'd want to take 2 parts per testing window. That's the first thing. So your scheduling And also as it relates to time management is really important, because you would ideally want to do your first part and schedule your first section in the first to second week of July. The next section would be towards the end of August, or as you notice, you can test through the first 10 days of the third month of each quarter. So the end of August to the first part of September. Then the third part, again, you'd want to take around the middle of October. And then the fourth part, again, would be towards the end of November, the first part of December. The reason that we do that is, or that we suggest that is, one, again, that gives you the most optimal time to study for each section. In terms of spacing, as you'll see coming up, we have some tips and recommendations coming up. It allows for the best possible testing scenario. So again, doing all 4 parts in 6 months is, again, like we said, it requires an extra bit of dedication and attention to detail in the scheduling. The other thing that it does is, I've worked with a lot of people who have set up the system to try and pass all 4 parts in 6 months. And what it does is it allows some flexibility in the scheduling process, where if you get into this and it's like, okay, you know what, I was going to do all 4 parts in 6 months, but I really need to extend that out to about 8 months. What it does is it allows some scheduling flexibility for you to say move that last part out to using this model the following January. But even doing so, even if you were to take the 4th part in January, that's July, August, September, October, November, December, January, that's still about 7 months. So keep that in mind in terms of the way that you schedule your sections. Now, let's talk about study plan considerations. So the first thing is how long or how often am I going to have to study? So at Surgent, we recommend that if you're doing a 6-month plan, you're going to need to study about 15 to 20 hours per week in order to finish within 6 months. Now, that is on average, and that is a suggested amount. It is going to vary with each individual student. Each individual student studies at a different pace. They have different learning styles. There's different areas of strength and areas of weakness. So take this as an average. But as you're sitting out and planning this out, can I do this in 6 months? Think that in your head, you're going to have to study about 15 to 20 hours per week in order to finish within 6 months. So then other components come up. Well, how many hours can you study per day? Obviously, that has a lot to do with your learning style too. It also has to do with your outside of your not just your work, but your family requirements as well, right? What do I have going on after work? What do I have going on the weekends? Things like that. A very common study pattern with people is they'll study, a couple hours, during the week, 2 to 3 hours, 4 days a week, and then they'll have big study sessions on the weekend. Again, this is not set in stone, but it is an average, and it's something that you want to wrap your head around. Passing the CPA exam in 6 months and doing, passing it, getting it scheduled, studying, taking it and passing it, it effectively becomes a part-time job. And so that's why we use this model of 15 to 20 hours per week, keeping in mind how many hours you can study per day as well. The other thing to keep in mind too is, again, with it, it's an estimate. As you go along, particularly in the Surgent course, we push out a study plan to you, or our study program that, again, adapts to how you were doing, like I said, with your areas of strength and your areas of weakness. And so this might adapt or need to adapt depending upon which section you are or what your rate of retention is. So again, keep that in mind. It might be a particular section or particular topics you only need, even 10 to 15 hours per week because, you know particular areas really well, and your retention, the areas that you need work on, you're getting those quickly. You might need a little bit more. So I'm hitting this topic or this particular point because this is really important. Setting up a study program and then sticking with it. A couple other things. Do you need a day off? You absolutely need to take a day or some time off. A common mistake that people make often is that they don't do that, and they start out really well, and then by the time they get to the second or third week, the burnout tends to set in because you just haven't had some time to just shut it down, shut it off, and kind of refresh your mind a little bit. So we always recommend, if at all possible, as you're setting up your schedule, you have at least one day where you don't have to think about the CPA exam. Also, the other thing that we recommend, and again, this goes back to the scheduling component of this, is that you take a week, at least a week or two off between parts. So as you're preparing to sit for the exam, you're going to go through and you're going to set out your study program. You're going to take at least one full simulated final exam. A full simulated final exam, which is 4 hours in length and simulates the actual exam that you're going to take. And we recommend that you try and simulate that in exam-like conditions if possible, right? So not laying on your couch or, a lot of distractions in the background, but really simulating the exam. Then you're going to go take the exam, and you need to have a week to sort of just gather yourself and set up your study schedule for the next section. So if you go back and look at those, and again, like I said, we'll send these slides out after the presentation. If you go back and look at those calendars, keep that in mind because that's really important. If any of you are current students or plan on joining us after this and becoming a Surgent student, we'll work with you to set up a study program if you need help. And again, a lot of these things, you'll see why they make sense as you actually begin to do this. So what do you do then when you're studying? Well, as part of your study program or study plan, the first 3 weeks, we at Surgent recommend that you do at least 50 to 60 questions per day. As part of the assessment, you're going to do about that amount and you're going to take about 2 weeks, about 10 days actually, about 10 days to complete that assessment. But the first 3 weeks, you want to really immerse yourself in the multiple choice questions. There's a tremendous amount of learning that goes on, even if you haven't seen these questions at all when you're taking these cold. If you work through them, look at the answers, whether you got the question right or wrong, and immerse yourself in this process. You're going to do some learning right out of the gate. Then, combined with these 50 to 60 questions per day, you're going to have some reading and you're going to have some lectures that go with it to reinforce these topics and to help you learn. And then you're going to start mixing in the simulations. So it's important, and I want to spend a minute on this because we're going to talk about exam format later for those of you who may not have seen it. It's really important to mix in the simulations within 2, if for sure, before 3 weeks, because the exam is 50% simulations now. So it's really important to understand how to work the simulations, to be familiar with them, and to understand the various types. And we'll talk about that coming up shortly, a little bit more. And then the final stretch, 1 week before the exam, you go through, you redo any low-scoring simulations that you have, and then you complete the practice exam. Ideally, if time allows, it would be nice to take, if you have time, to take 2 simulated exams. With the compressed nature of trying to get all 4 parts in 6 months, that might be a little bit difficult, but for sure, you want to at least take 1 simulated 4-hour exam to prepare you for the exam day. Okay. Next thing we want to talk about is scheduling your exams. Now, the application process can take up to 6 weeks. So in some cases, actually, it can take up to 8 weeks. The average is about 6 weeks. So it's important to apply early. I've mentioned several times, ad nauseum probably to a lot of you, time management is a large part of the exam process. Sometimes people forget about this portion of the process, and it's really important because think of it as 2 silos, but you're running them simultaneously. So as you begin studying for the exam, so you sign up for the CPA review course, you begin to plan out your studies, you start studying for the first part, we'll say financial, because that's what we have in our example. The application process coincides with that. It's separate, but it coincides because you have to go through having your transcript sent to either to NASBA or directly to the Board of Examiners, depending upon which state you live in. They have to ensure that you're exam prep or exam testing eligible. Ultimately, you're going to receive a notice to schedule, which is what you use to schedule your exam through the parametric testing centers. And then you have to schedule your exam accordingly so you can get all 4 in 6 months. the application process is sometimes the part that people forget about. And I've talked to a lot of people who had to push out their study plans because either their transcripts didn't get sent over in a timely manner, or they were missing a class and didn't know about it, you know, until it was too late, or their notice to schedule, you know, came late in the process, and so they couldn't get the date they wanted. Point being, all of this stuff can be avoided as long as you keep this, you know, as part of the actual exam process, the scheduling process, and you know, make sure you stay on top of it. I'm sure everybody knows this, but just as a reminder, you know, your transcripts have to go directly from your college or university directly to NASBA, the State Board of Accountancy. And so, you know, depending upon when you graduate, especially those of you who are graduating in May, sometimes you may need to stay on your registrar to make sure that these get sent over in a timely manner. So again, be proactive about it, about the application process. One other note I would like to add as it relates to actually scheduling your exams, and this is really important. There's been some research that's been done lately about when people should sit for the exam, meaning what time of day they should sit for their exam. There's been actually some really in-depth studies done on circadian rhythms and internal time clocks. If anybody's interested in that research, I can send that out after the exam as well. But the most important thing I would offer, and again, this just comes from years of experience in talking to people, is make sure and schedule the exam accordingly with when you like to take exams. I will give you you know, an important thing. Me personally, I am not a morning person. Don't like to do very many things in the morning. I always joke with my friends that as the day goes on, I get stronger, right? I like doing this webinar. I'm in the Eastern time zone. I like doing this at 4 o'clock. So I'm probably not going to schedule my exam at, you know, 8 a.m. in the morning. Conversely, people they feel fresh. They like to get it, you know, right out of the gate. They want to get the test done. So you might be one of those people that schedule it 8 or 9 in the morning. Take that part seriously. And that again goes to the time management aspect of the whole application process. So you get your notices to schedule in plenty of time, and you can easily pick the time and day that you want to take the exam. And then last component on this, for those of you who may not have seen this before, again, NASBA is the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. NASBA manages the application and registration process for 32 out of the 55 jurisdictions. So if you're unsure whether you're managed your state board, you apply directly or you go through NASBA. If you just want to take a copy down this website, this will take you right there, and you can easily identify how to handle the application process. Okay, so next thing, let's talk a little bit again about the CPA exam format. For those of you who are in the process of testing, or maybe have seen one of us do a CPA exam presentation before, a lot of this information is going to be familiar to you, but there's a reason why we're spending some time going through it. So this is the current CPA exam format. There were changes made in April of 2017, as I'm sure everybody knows, and the biggest change was that the number of multiple choice questions in some cases were reduced, but simulations were added to all parts, including BEC, which prior to April of 2017 just had multiple choice questions and written communications. BEC now has simulations as well. The other thing that was added was a 15-minute break. Prior to April of 2017, if you needed to take a break, all breaks were optional and the clock continued to run. However, now there's a 15-minute break that is given that does not count against the candidate's time. A lot of feedback has come back in the last 12 months from exam candidates who've taken it since the break was installed. Most candidates are taking advantage of the break, and we definitely recommend it. Even if you don't use the full 15 minutes, it allows you to sort of just reset, give yourself a break, no pun intended, sort of clear your head, kind of gather yourself, get up and stretch, you know, just whatever you need to do. It also is a great arbiter of where you are time-wise on the exam. So a couple things then as it relates to the 4-hour exam and why we're talking about this. Again, back to time management. The title of this webinar was not how to take in 6 months, but it's how to pass in 6 months. So remember, we talked about, you know, the studying, the taking of the final exam and prepping yourself. When you get actually into the test day, time management on the exam itself is of the utmost importance. As we said, simulations were added to the exam. And so on these multiple choice questions, and you can see, and depending upon the part, you know, 66, 72, 76, 62, you're really going to need to spend about 1:10 to 1:20 per question to be able to leave enough time for the simulations. One of the common mistakes that people make is, again, and you may even have met some people that think, well, I can just study for this exam just by doing multiple choice questions because I'm learning the concepts. I'm getting those down pat. I'm learning how to read, you know, the stem of the question first and see what the examiner is asking for and quickly rule out 2 of the 4 answers and become very sophisticated at multiple choice questions. That is a critical component, and it is one of the components of studying. But leaving time for the simulations is critical. And so what happens is, a lot of times, if you don't spend time not only just studying the simulations, but also making sure that you're answering these questions in 1:10 to 1:20 on average, people will get into the exam and they don't save enough time for the simulations. And I can honestly tell you that the 2 things that derail people in this process, one is losing credit for a part they passed because they didn't get everything done in the 18-month window, and 2, on the individual exams, it's not saving enough time for the simulations and getting too hung up on the, you know, not spending too much time on the multiple choice questions. So time management, not just in prepping, not just in the application process, not just in studying, but actually on the exam. So again, I'm repeating that probably more than necessary, but though that, again, common things that happen to people that are well prepared and, you know, went into this and they are just like, I studied, but then I got too hung up and I forgot to save enough time for the simulations. On BEC also, it's very important to not only practice the simulations because they were introduced, like we said, just a year ago, but also make sure and save time for the written communications. There are 3 written communications. It's 15% of the BEC total score. 2 of the 3 will be graded. It's really important that you save time to make sure and get all 3 done. Because obviously you don't know which of the 3, they're not going to count. And also, if you understand how to write a business memo, if you understand how to have correspondence, professional business correspondence, they're fairly easy points to get. Unless you're on the bubble of passing 74, 75, or 76, they're graded by the written communications are graded by a computer, and so they're really looking for keywords. You know, for instance, if you were asked to write a memo about inventory, right? Obviously, you'd want to include words like FIFO, LIFO, weighted average, things like that. And so, you know, if you're on the bubble of passing 74, 75, or 76, a human being will go back and look at this and double check to make sure that the computer graded the points accurately and gave you credit for the proper amount of points. But again, they're pretty easy to get. So make sure and save time for the written communications in BEC. And then again, just from a visual standpoint, just so you can see again, FAR, audit and regulation, 50% task-based simulations, 50% multiple choice questions, and then BEC, 50, 35, and 15 percentage-wise on written communications. Now, some other tips to help you along the way. This is really important because this is something that surprisingly not everybody knows about. So examiners include pre-test questions on the exam. It's 15 to 20% of each section. The questions are experimental and they do not count. Candidates will not know which questions are pre-test questions, obviously. So the reason why this is important is another way of saying the pre-test questions are the examiners want to know what a certain group of people testing at a particular time know about a particular concept. and they may or may not choose to integrate them for purposes of actual scoring later on at a later timeline. So if you're unaware that there's pretest questions, sometimes people will come in and they'll be like, well, I was so prepared, I studied everything, and then I got 3 or 4 questions that I'd never seen on a topic I'd never heard of, and it kind of derailed me. Odds are, if you are a prepared candidate and you have done the requisite work going into this, and you see a question on something that you've never seen or never studied, odds are it's a pretest question. Now, you don't know for sure, so if you come across one of those and you're uncertain what the answer is, make sure you guess. Never leave anything blank. The CPA exam is not a negatively graded exam, so it's okay to guess. But odds are, again, that if you see a question or few questions that you've never studied for, they're probably pretest questions. Okay. A couple other things as it relates to strategy. Never leave a question blank. Don't skip a question. Within each testlet, if you remember when we showed the groupings of questions, the 2 groupings of multiple choice questions and then the simulations, within each grouping of multiple choice questions or the simulations, you can pretty much do whatever you want, meaning you can change your answer, you can skip a question, you can go back to it. So if there's one question you're working through, let's say in financial, you're working through one of the multiple choice testlets and you see a question or 2 that you want to come back to, you don't want to spend too much time on one question in particular, and so it's okay to look at that question, flag it, and go back. Make sure, though, that you don't skip it, and make sure that you answer every question. And then again, just a couple things that we've already spent some time on. Make sure you're always watching the clock and that you're trying to get through the multiple choice questions as quickly as you can in order to save time for the simulations. Now, the next slide, and again, we're going to send this out to everybody. We're going to send out a copy of the slides to everybody that's on the webinar. But if you want to just take a look at this and maybe make some notes here, there's various types of simulations, and these are time estimates that you want to keep in mind and that you want to leave. Make sure that this is why you want to make sure that you have enough time to do the simulations. So we have a regular task-based simulation, which we suggest you allot for 12 to 15 minutes. Occasionally there will be what's called an enhanced test-based simulation, which may draw on some concepts or some specific ideas in greater detail, and they take a little bit longer to work. So the length of them is such that you're going to require a little bit more time to work it. I'm sure everybody's heard about the document review simulation. This was introduced introduced in the summer of 2016 and has become part of the exam since then. Basically you're given a set of documents and you have to determine which of the documents are relevant, and if they're relevant, what portion of them is relevant moving forward, and you'll have questions pertaining to each of these documents. The feedback that we've gotten, again, from candidates and from the AICPA is that this can take, some of them are, the candidates have just, basically blown through quickly. Some of them taken longer. So if you're doing some math in your head, right, and allotting what's the maximum amount of time I'd probably want to spend on any of these simulations, then you can back it out in your studying to figure out, again, how much time you have depending upon the section per multiple choice questions. There's going to be a research simulation where you'll have to look up either, depending upon the section, maybe something in the tax code, a statement of audit standards, a FASB, something like, you're going to have to do some research. And again, those, if you have studied and prepared and know how to work through the database, do the research, those usually don't take too long. And then finally, the written communications, again, make sure that you save enough time to do all 3 of those. Okay, a couple other things that we'd like to point out. As of April of 2018, Excel has been added as a tool. Prior to this, the examiners were using their own spreadsheet, but they've switched to a Windows-based software experience, and part of that is that their Excel is now in the exam. It's important to note that you're not being tested on your Excel skills, but having a requisite knowledge of Excel and how to use Excel is really important. One of the things that we hear, and again, I'm assuming that most of everybody that's on this webinar today, most everybody is working for a firm right now, and you may have heard this. You know, the people who do the hiring and send you out on the engagements, it's critical to know Excel, and sometimes student knowledge of Excel is not what it should be. So it's important not only to make sure that you know it just for your job, but also it can be very, very helpful on the exam. As an aside, Surgent offers an 8-hour Excel course specifically for accountants. This is not a general Excel course, but it's Excel for accountants. And as part of the follow-up of this, we will send out some information about that to any of those of you who are interested. And then finally, we have part of the experience enhancement was, again, switching to a Windows-based software experience. Those of you anybody who's on here who took the exam prior to April of 2017, if you had if you did that, when you go and you take it now, you'll notice an updated design. The monitors are bigger. There's been some enhancements for those who need ADA support. And overall, the experience has become much more in line with what we do every day on our jobs. So, and of course, that's, our software and our software in our course obviously mimics those as well. So it's really important. But again, it's important to be familiar with the tests, the exam, the requirements, and also the exam environment. The last thing I would like to point out for those of you, it may or may not be something you're interested in, but it tends to affect a portion of people that take the exam. There's a group of people that take the exam who the actual environment, like physically, like where you're sitting, where you're taking the exam, is something that you'd like to be familiar with. It sort of eases that test anxiety, and it is an actual anxiety that exists amongst a certain percentage of test takers. So if you're one of those people, you can go online and you can take a virtual tour of Prometric testing centers. Again, Prometric testing centers are where you take the exam, and for a small fee, I believe it's $30, you can actually take a tour, an in-person tour of the Prometric testing site where you're going to take the exam. So if you're one of those people that has some anxiety about where I'm actually going to take the exam, and what it looks like in the environment, please take advantage of that, because that is it is an anxiety that does afflict a certain amount of test takers. And again, when you're trying to take this exam, no matter if it's in 12 months, 9 months, or especially in a compressed time frame of 6 months, it is critical that you do not leave anything to chance. So again, it's the registration process, it's getting all 4 parts scheduled, it's making sure that you have enough time to study, that there's some flexibility in there, but it's also the little details. It's making sure that, I've done the registration process, got my notice to schedule in plenty of time so I can get the time of day or the location that I want. It's making sure that, even little things, side point I'll bring up, even little things such as bringing the correct notice to schedule to the exam is something that can derail people. If you Google afterwards, top 10 mistakes CPA exam candidates make, you'll see we've talked about a lot of them, and most of them are completely avoidable, and they're kind of laughable. You're sitting there going, oh, I would never do this. But things like, I didn't make it to the exam site on time, I got stuck in traffic, I went to the wrong exam site. It's quite interesting, because like I said, they seem laughable when you're reading them, but they're mistakes that very smart people, talented people, and people who've studied and prepared for the exam make. So don't leave anything to chance. So with that, that wraps up the webinar portion of this, the content portion of this. Again, like I said, at the end, we'll send out a copy of the slides. We'll send out a link to the recording, and we will also send out a special offer for any of those people who are interested in signing up for our course, along with some information about our Excel course as well. And with that, I'll open it up and just we'll see if there's anybody has any questions. I'll give it just a minute. Okay, and yeah, one question that came through is, will the slides be available? Yes, we'll send those out to all the attendees. We'll send out a copy of the slides in PDF format that that everybody will be able to have. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, again, I want to thank everybody for participating. Again, this is it is an aggressive, it is aggressive setup to do all 4 parts in 6 months, but again, with the proper preparation, it certainly can be done. So I thank you all for joining us, and best of luck in your studies.